the coalition has revealed its nuclear energy costings, courtesy of Frontier Economics, an independent economics consultancy. Now, of course, the numbers were rather flattering, suggesting the plan could be at least $260 billion cheaper than Labour's renewables plan. Now, of course, there are detractors. Some of the detractors range from people who are skeptical of any costings, thinking that any political party is probably BSing them a little bit. However, many of the other detractors have come from the usual places. For example, the Labour Party and the Greens, and people who simply have a vested interest in pursuing renewables. So let's have a bit of a look into this. Now, I should start by saying that I don't have a background in nuclear engineering or engineering of this type. So this means I can understand the financial modelling behind it, but I have no special insight into the technical intricacies of power generation. Therefore, my position is twofold. First, I prefer to rely on the modelling from other independent sources, like the US or France, where regulators have no vested interest in our partisan debate in Australia, and where they found nuclear to be cost effective. Second, I will look at the trash fire in Germany, where they turned off the nuclear power plants, then had to scramble to replace it with fossil fuels, leading to the whole issue that was ongoing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And third, we should relax the blanket prohibition on nuclear and let the people put their money where their mouth is. To this end, we'd obviously need to have proper safety controls and regulations and the like, but we need to look at whether it is actually financially viable. And to this end, we've got major banks backing nuclear, we've got corporations such as Amazon building out small modular reactors. Now, of course, there are entities that are also backing renewables. Banks are also lending to renewables and nuclear. But this suggests that maybe a sensible combination of the two could be the most cost-effective approach. After all, some renewables might be cost-effective, for example, rooftop solar and the like. However, some renewables might be completely non-cost-effective. This could include building solar on prime farmland, or building wind farms in environmental zones, or in the middle of nowhere, where it's super expensive to actually build them and then connect them to the grid. The marginal cost of another megawatt of energy increases the more you need to go out and install it in rather inconvenient locations. And therefore nuclear may or may not be the answer, but we need to have a proper debate and let people who are not exactly vested interest in the Labour Party decide this for us. And therefore I'm in favour of having an open mind toward nuclear. Now, of course, Australia's regulators have suggested that nuclear might be more costly than renewables, but the regulators in the United States seem to believe otherwise. I want to know why it is the US has reached a different conclusion from Australia, and the Labour Party simply isn't explaining that very well. And as a result, I would like to see more investigation into the use of nuclear, potentially a consideration of rolling out a trial. But of course, much of the negative reaction has simply been partisan and from the usual quarters. For example, Jim Chalmers, who has been repeatedly community noted, has cited an article from the ABC that claims to be negative on the coalition's costings. Now, I'll dig into that article in just a bit. However, it wasn't exactly persuasive to me. Allegra Spender is another example. She's part of the Climate 200-backed Teal Independents. She slammed the costings. However, of course, her Twitter bio says she's a renewable energy advocate, and her main financial backer, it seems, is invested in renewables. Chris Bowen is another example. He described the coalition's plan as a Christmas con job, seemingly echoing the language used by Greens leader Adam Bandt, who called it a dangerous con job. It's almost as if they were singing from the same hymn sheet. Now, I don't really regard Chris Bowen as especially reliable in this context. After all, the Labour Party has a policy against nuclear, so all of the Labour politicians are going to come out against nuclear, so I'll take what they say with a grain of salt. There's a clear partisan reason for the ALP going out against it. Nevertheless, let's look in at that ABC article that the ALP members cited so much. Now, to my mind, the ABC itself has very little credibility. After all, we all remember the Heston Russell situation. Now, the author of this specific piece was not involved in the Heston Russell situation, and was not impugned in any way in terms of that particular author's credibility. But the ABC clearly has a bit of a slant, so I would obviously want to look at multiple sources, not just rely on the ABC. This is more so, given that the experts cited in that ABC article were not exactly persuasive. The experts are purported to rebut the coalition's plan. However, those experts include people from the left-leaning Grattan Institute and from a body called Green Markets. I'm not super convinced by either. They also cite an academic who says that, quote, people should take with a pinch of salt claims they hear from anyone about the energy transition and timelines and costs and rates of progress, most particularly for any time in the future more than 5 years. I think that is entirely accurate. Any of these costings appear to be a little bit rubbery, whether they're coming from the coalition or from the ALP. The academic is absolutely right there. However, where I would diverge is the next bit, where that same academic says, this nonsense of hiring a modeler, whether private or government institution, is silly. Leave that for academia. But don't assume that this is a useful way to take this forward. Now, here, I'm not totally convinced about just leaving things to academia. I'm not entirely convinced that academics necessarily have an especial expertise in many of these areas that would enable them to engage in both engineering modeling and financial modeling. There might be lots of engineers, but do they have the financial expertise to be able to model it and know how banks and the like are going to react? Similarly, there might be lots of business academics, but do they necessarily have the energy expertise? Now, in theory, one could create a joint body between the two, but that assumes there are actually synergies between the multiple departments, which is a big assumption, but it also assumes that those academics themselves don't have a vested interest in propping up Labour or the Greens, which academics seem to invariably support. Furthermore, many academics have zero real-world expertise or zero real-world experience, meaning I'm not convinced they are necessarily better than professional modelers. They might be, they might not be. It really needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case circumstance. They also cite another academic who remarks that having the debate itself creates uncertainty, and uncertainty raises prices. Now, that can be a fair enough statement. After all, it applies in myriad other areas. For example, in relation to housing policy, whenever we have this continued harebrained debate about increasing housing taxes, that spooks the market, it undermines construction because it undermines supply, and the reason for that is people don't necessarily know what the payoff is going to be, so supply goes down. Now, of course, if there are adverse changes, supply will remain at that lower level and in fact decrease by even more. But every time you have a debate about potentially increasing costs or creating uncertainty, it is obviously inherently bad for financial decision making. That academic is correct there to some extent. However, of course, it is worth noting that if we're seeing issues with some renewables, for example, we're saying we need to build renewables in further and further more inconvenient locations, which are going to be increasingly expensive to connect to the grid, or we're proposing to build renewables on farmland, we need to consider, well, how exactly are we getting the agricultural produce that we need to actually eat? Or is it that they're also proposing that we don't eat and we go into just being vegans or something similar? I'm not entirely sure exactly what their proposal is if we are facing some issues with renewables. Nevertheless, that academic is correct about the uncertainty, and therefore we need to be cautious about leaping to conclusions. Now, the Australian Financial Review also published an article against the coalition's plan. Now, the AFR itself is not exactly pro-Dutton or pro-Morrison. Rather, the AFR appears to be more in favour of people like the Teal Independents, or people like Malcolm Turnbull. Different authors at AFR and different opinion writers at AFR will have different slants. Nevertheless, the AFR came out with an article saying that the coalition's plan was underpinned by distorted numbers. However, if we dig into this article, they also say that the cost advantage to nuclear might shrink to only $106 billion versus $260 billion. Now, that may be correct, but it is still a cost advantage. 106 is smaller than 260, but it's still better than nothing. So I'm not entirely sure that the article was quite as damning as maybe some people have painted it out to be. Now, the AFR did dig a little bit into some of the coalition's numbers, and they made some valid points. But even with those valid points, there still appeared to be a cost saving. A separate op-ed in the AFR by Stephen Hamilton also raised caution about the coalition's nuclear modelling. Now, Stephen Hamilton is not exactly pro-Labour. He has heavily criticised Jim Chalmers and the ALP for their fiscal management. However, he also is not necessarily all in the coalition's camp, as we can see from this op-ed. He's argued that the coalition's nuclear modelling is, quote, worth nothing. Now, Stephen Hamilton's rhetoric is often a little bit on the, I'll say, hyperbolic and certainly attention grabbing side. So we do need to bear that in mind when we're analysing this article. But in essence, his point is that the coalition's modelling is based on some assumptions that don't necessarily make a ton of sense. Those assumptions, for example, include assumptions about how much the nuclear is going to be operating at capacity, the nuclear power plants being operating at 90% capacity according to the coalition's modelling. He also noted that coalition's plans hold for nuclear to really be coming into fruition in the distant future, because it takes quite some time for the nuclear power plants to actually come into being, which over the course of that time would lead to more carbon emissions occurring. He argued, therefore, that the coalition's modelling not only overstates the cost saving, but might in fact not have a cost saving. However, to be clear, Stephen Hamilton also seemingly is not all in on the ALP's modelling. Potentially the ALP's modelling itself might have inaccuracies. So it's not as if he is saying that the coalition's modelling is wrong and the ALP's modelling is right. It could be that they are both wrong. It's just a matter of whose modelling is wrong by more and whose modelling leads to the higher cost. But it does appear that this op-ed is negative on the coalition's policy. So where does this leave us? We've got sections of the media that are quite negative on the coalition's plan. We've got sections of the media that are a little bit ambivalent toward the coalition's plan. Personally, I don't necessarily know whether nuclear is the solution. But what I do know is all of the rhetoric coming up from Labour is not exactly itself credible because it's not exactly non-partisan. Similarly, in my opinion, with the rhetoric coming up from the Teal independents. Of course, by contrast, the coalition has a vested interest in their plan. So therefore, we've got a whole lot of people who have vested interest in promoting their particular plan. Now, personally, I would prefer to look at some of the precedent overseas, where it has become clear that nuclear has been an important part of the energy grid in places like the US and France. And neither of those countries have a particular interest in our partisan debate. The US is more conservative-leaning, France is much more left-leaning. So if you have a conservative-leaning country and a left-leaning country both pursuing nuclear, it appears that one can set these partisan issues aside, and maybe it is that nuclear is at least a potential option, something worth exploring, something potentially worth trying out, or something at least worth letting the market determine whether or not to invest in. Now this of course does lead to the other issue of, well, if nuclear is so good, why is it that Peter Dutton's plan is calling for taxpayer funding to go into nuclear? Now here I just have a bit of an issue. After all, renewables are also underpinned by taxpayer support, underpinned by things such as guarantees in relation to power prices and the like. So it's not as if there are no subsidies to renewables. There absolutely are subsidies to renewables. There absolutely is support for renewables being rolled out from the government. It's not as if the taxpayer isn't paying for a lot of the renewables rollout. Rather, it's just that it's a little bit more buried and a little bit less clear-cut and front of mind relative to the coalition's plan. To give the coalition some credit, therefore, at least they're being open about how much this is costing the taxpayer, as opposed to the renewable situation, where the government is much less open about it, and where it is either coming in the form of taxpayer subsidies, or alternatively in the form of higher energy prices, or more energy unreliability. Either way, at least the coalition is being a little bit upfront about it. I'll also note that if, and this is a massive if, the nuclear power plants are run in a proper commercial manner and in an arm's length manner, then one can make the government support. Again, this is a big if with a lot of maybes. So say, for example, we run these nuclear plants in a proper arm's length manner, and they become financially viable. What the government could then do is they could say, well, let's privatize these. Not necessarily fully, but to some extent. They might say, well, we want the private sector expertise and perhaps the private sector incentives to ensure the nuclear power plants are being run properly. So what the government might do is they might sell off a majority stake, but keep a decent-sized minority chunk, so they can keep generating dividends without all of the downsides of government control. Because the major downside of government-owned organizations is they become super inefficient, because you get a lot of entrenched bureaucrats and entrenched government workers that have no incentive to really improve how things are operating. Rather, the incentives simply don't work out. Compare this to the private sector, where there are incentives to make things more efficient. Now, many government workers will be high-quality government workers, but they can be more than offset but the government workers that are simply not exerting their full effort because they're not incentivized to do so. So the government get the best of both worlds. It can sit back and get a dividend from that particular nuclear power generator, while then mostly privatizing it so you get the incentive benefit of the private sector. Now, of course, that rests on the government managing this in a proper arm's length way and in a commercial way, which can be a massive caveat here, but it is something to bear in mind in terms of how the coalition is approaching it. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts about the nuclear energy plan. Is the coalition right? Is the coalition wrong? Do you think we should go down the nuclear path? Do you think we shouldn't? Do you think we should at least trial it out and keep an open mind? Let me know what you think in the comments below.